Hello, bio students, and welcome to our fat lecture, where we are going to talk about fat. And fat, in biological terms, is a group of hydrophobic molecules. Now, I don't mean hydrophobic like it literally has the feeling that it's scared of water, but that really, it's scared of water. It will not mix with water. So, fat, or lipids, as we are often referring to them, do not make a homogeneous mixture with water because they cannot dissolve in water. So let's take a closer look. We're going to look at the basic lipid structure. And our basic lipid structure includes 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol, and that gives us a lipid. And a lipid is a lot of times referred to as a triglyceride, especially if it's in this arrangement. So what I'm going to do is we're going to draw this out chemically. Now you don't have to memorize how many carbons or how many hydrogens, you just need to understand the basic structure. So I'm first going to draw our 3 fatty acids. And our 3 fatty acids are basically carbon chains with a ton of hydrogen on it. Now, we remember that hydrogen absolutely loves carbon. So wherever carbon is, especially in our bodies, you will usually find hydrogen. So at any available point on the carbon chain, hydrogen is going to want to bond to carbon. Now this right here is going to be our fatty acid. And we said we had 3 of those, so I'm just going to kind of make it look like a square. And we're going to add 2 more because we have 3. How perfect is that? Now, a lot of times when we have this carbon chain with hydrogen bonded to it, we call it a hydrocarbon chain. So we have 2 more hydrocarbon chain and another hydrocarbon chain, and these hydrocarbon chains are our fatty acids. We have our 3 fatty acids and we have our 1 glycerol. So let's change our color. And our glycerol is another carbon chain. It's a 3 carbon chain, and yes, it's got hydrogen hanging out on it. And these carbons bond to the end carbon of the fatty acid. So this right here is our glycerol. And together, 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids make a common lipid structure, or a lot of times oh, that's totally spelled wrong. Tri with an I, call it a triglyceride. So when we're talking about fat, when you look at the back of a nutrition label, you see that fat is divided into 2 types. We have saturated fat and unsaturated fat. And saturated fat we usually see a lot on products like butter, my personal favorite, lard, bacon grease, bacon, or the fat that's in meat or any products with a lot of red meat especially. And saturated fat is typically sourced from animals. And unsaturated fat includes fats that are sourced from plants, and specifically their seeds. We usually get a lot of our unsaturated fat from seeds. Plants don't really store saturated fat anywhere else, so that's where we have to get it. So when we look at the difference between these two, let's go to our next slide. Our saturated fat is always going to be solid at room temperature, whereas our unsaturated fat is going to be liquid at room temperature. That's a 1, even though it looks like a 2. There we go. And our Saturated fat is sourced from animals. And our unsaturated fat is sourced from plants. One exception on the saturated fat, a saturated fat that is sourced from plants is coconut oil. And if you've ever purchased it, it's a pretty thick goo. It kind of has the consistency of lard, and that is actually saturated fat sourced from plants. And also saturated fats are probably the ones that you've heard to stay away from. Saturated fats are linked to heart disease, and unsaturated fats include our omegas, are healthier, and they're found also in fish as well. Fish, and they are healthier. So we want diets that are rich in unsaturated fat because our body actually needs these fatty acids. When we get too much saturated fat, that's when we get in trouble. So let's take the magic school bus, super magic school bus, and look at the molecular level of saturated versus unsaturated fat. And we're also going to figure out where the source of these names come from. So if we look at a saturated fat, here is our fatty acid, right? Right here. We have our hydrocarbon chain, a lot of carbons. They all have a single bond. Every single one of these is a single bond between each carbon molecule. So these are all single bonds. And we call this saturated because every single carbon is hanging on to as many hydrogens as it possibly can. So we call it saturated because they are hydrogen saturated. This is a hydrogen saturated fatty acid. Well, if you look here at this unsaturated fatty acid, you'll probably immediately notice that there's these two lines. And unsaturated fat has one or more double bonds. And we call it unsaturated because each carbon doesn't always have the total amount of hydrogens that it could. So there are actually less hydrogen. There's less hydrogen in unsaturated fat than there is saturated fat. And the crazy thing is this double bond causes a kink, an actual physical kink in the structure of the unsaturated fat. And that becomes really important when? Right now. So why does unsaturated fat, why is it liquid at room temperature, and why is saturated fat solid at room temperature? Well, saturated fat has these beautiful long hydrocarbon chains that are nice and flat. And we know things that are nice and flat like paper, they stack really nicely and they stack really close together. So when we have molecules that are stacked really close together, they become rigid. And those rigid fatty acids stacked together keep saturated fat solid. And when we look at unsaturated fat, it's super kinky, right? So it has all these bends in it, and it's bending all these different ways, and it actually causes the molecules to not be able to compress on each other as much. It's like taking a stack of paper, like a ream of paper, like 500 pages of paper, and a saturated fat is when they're all nicely stacked on top of each other and you store them on a nice little shelf. And an unsaturated fat is like taking all of those sheets of paper and crumpling them up and trying to fit them in the same place. Well, it's impossible. These kinks cause the unsaturated fat to the molecules to flow more over each other and also to not stack as tightly. So that way the unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature. So here are some examples. These are just well-known fatty acids, super famous. This stearic fatty acid, you can probably guess, is derived from beef, steer. And here we have some other, what would these be? Would these be saturated or unsaturated? These have kinks in them, so they would be unsaturated. And we can see that some of them are kinkier than others. Well, actually, what's interesting is you've heard of omega-3s. Omega-3s are one of those essential fatty acids that your body needs. Well, omega-3 is quite kinky. So the more kinky a fatty acid is, actually the more fluid it's going to be and the more healthy it is for your body. So this is a popular, not popular, but very common omega-3. And oleic acid, this is what's actually in olive oil derived from olives. So I would like you right now to pause the screen, and you are going to write 2 to 3 sentence answer in your notes that answers these 2 questions. Why are saturated fats solid at room temperature, and why are unsaturated fats liquid at room temperature? Ready? Pause. Okay, now you're back and you've written your 2 to 3 sentences. I'm sure you sound like a total bio genius. But let me just do a quick summary to make sure that yours is right. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature because their fatty acids, the hydrocarbon chains, do not have any double bonds. And without any double bonds, those fatty acids can stack really nicely and really closely to each other, creating a solid. Now, unsaturated fatty acids have kinks in them, one or more. They could have a lot. And the kinkier they are, the harder it is for them to stack on top of each other, keeping those molecules able to flow and essentially the liquid that they're making up liquid instead of solid. That makes sense. I kind of butchered that, but you know what I mean. All right, so why do we need fat? So you're hearing me talk about how fat can be linked to heart disease and how we don't want to eat bacon grease and all that stuff. Well, fat is actually quite important. It's important for you to have it in your diet. Fat is mainly important because we need it for energy. And it actually has 2 times the amount of energy than any carbohydrate that we have. And specifically, we use fat as energy storage. And fat is stored in these specialized cells called adipose cells that make up adipose tissue. Sometimes they're called lipocytes because they carry lipids. What these cells are able to expand and contract based on the available fat in your bloodstream, available lipids in your bloodstream. So these adipose cells, or these lipocytes, store their fat in a kind of a giant container like a vacuole. And when your body needs it, it will excrete it. And when your body needs to store it, it will put it back in. So these cells actually expand and shrink. The next type of lipid I'd like us to talk about is a phospholipid. And these are super important, and you will hear this word a lot this year. Now I want to introduce you to Phyllis. Phyllis is a dirty hippie. And we know that dirty hippies, they smell a little bit. Their bodies are a little oily because they don't take showers. However, they always have this long, beautiful, shiny, shimmery, clean hair. Now, I want you to remember the story of the dirty hippie. And this specific hippie is named Phyllis. And I call her Phyllis, the phospholipid. So phospholipids are composed of 3 parts. They have one head, which is hydrophilic, and they have 2 tails, which are lipids, lipid tail, that is hydrophobic. And the hydrophilic head is actually made of, here's a hint, phospholipid. It's made of a phosphate group. And we know that phosphate groups are polar, causing them to love water. So I say that Phyllis is bipolar because she has her hydrophilic head and her lipid hydrophobic tail. And her lipid hydrophobic tail, these are each a fatty acid right here. So these little tails are fatty acids. Now let's take a chemical look at phospholipids. We have, let's do a different color. We have our phosphate group right here. We have our glycerol group right here. And then we have our two hydrophobic tails that are comprised of fatty acids. Now you look at these hydrophobic tails and they're actually different. One is a nice straight hydrocarbon chain and the other one is a hydrocarbon chain with a kink in it. So what does that tell you about what type of fatty acids they are? Well, it tells you that this right here is a saturated fatty acid and this right here is an unsaturated fatty acid. So it's important to be able to identify that kink right there. Now, phospholipids are found everywhere in your body. In fact, you would be super dead without phospholipids because they are what makes your cell membrane. Now, because of their hydrophobic, hydrophilic nature, when phospholipids are in water, they do this automatic self-assemble where all of the tails bend in towards each other and all of the heads are out touching the water. So since our cells are aqueous on the inside and aqueous on the outside, we have our phospholipid bilayer kind of formed automatically just by being in the presence of water. The next type of lipid we're going to talk about is a steroid. Now, steroids are 4 fused carbon chains. And the most common steroid is cholesterol. Now let's see if we can draw this together. So our 4 fused carbon chains, we have a carbon chain right here. You know that when you draw carbon chains, hopefully you remember this from chemistry, but each point represents a carbon. We have a carbon chain here. Look at my beautiful drawings. Then we have another carbon chain here, and we have a 5 carbon chain here. And this you should be able to identify. This is cholesterol. And cholesterol, even though sometimes you hear it in a bad way, like, oh, I got high cholesterol, it's actually something that is super necessary for our body. Now, there's different types of cholesterol, but we get it from 2 different ways. We have cholesterol made in our liver and also cholesterol that we eat in our food. Cholesterol is also super important because it's in our cell membranes and it's actually embedded within the phospholipid bilayer and helps with its fluidity. So here we have our little phospholipid bilayer. We see that it's much more complex, our cell membrane, than just a single phospholipid bilayer. But we have these little cholesterols embedded within it, and that helps keep the phospholipid bilayer fluid and able to interact better with its surroundings. Another thing that cholesterols are, let's clear this, they're basically the source molecule for our steroid-based hormones. So, So our steroid-based hormones, some ones that you probably know the best are our sex hormones, which would be progesterone, testosterone, and estradiol. So steroids, super important. You should be able to identify them as well. Now we're going to play a game called Name That Molecule. Take a second, pause the video, and try to name what each molecule is that I've posted on the screen. All right, now that you've named each molecule, we look at molecule number 1. I can see that it has a lot of double bonds, and also each carbon doesn't have a hydrogen lurking on it, so it is not very saturated with hydrogen. So this is our unsaturated fatty acid. I'm just going to put Fa. Number 2, I see a phosphate group. That should give it away. I see a hydrocarbon chain, a straight one, and I see one with a kink in it. Well, that tells me that it is a phospholipid because it is a phosphate group with a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat attached to it. Number 3, wow, look at that one. That's crazy. We have 3 hydrocarbon chains, which kind of look like fatty acids, right? And we have 1 glycerol right here. So this is going to be a triglyceride. spelled correctly this time. Number 4 is the only one that kind of looks different, huh? So we have 4 fused carbon rings. This is our steroid. And number 5 is a beautiful hydrocarbon chain with no double bonds. Each carbon is totally saturated with hydrogen, so that is going to be saturated fatty acid. Excellent job. So, in review, what did we learn about fat today? Basic fat structure includes 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids, which makes a triglyceride. Saturated fat is sourced from animals, solid at room temperature, and no double bonds in fatty acids. Unsaturated fat is sourced from plants. It's liquid at room temperature and contains 1 or more double bond in the fatty acid. Remember, the kinkier the fatty acid, the more healthy it is. Fat is crazy energy storage. We have it because it basically can give our bodies 2 times the amount of energy than any carbohydrate, and sometimes it's much, much more than that. We know that lipids are super important because they are a huge role in our cells, which are specifically the cell membranes are made up of phospholipids, which includes a phosphate group and a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. And steroids are used for chemical signals within our body, and the base of most of the steroids in our body are cholesterol based, which is a lipid as well. So hopefully you enjoyed our fat talk on fat, and I will see you soon.